First and foremost, I'd like to speak to Sung, though, and as the public has not really had the opportunity to see the exhibition yet, so we want to whet their appetite a bit. I'd like to begin by discussing the title, because we went back and forth with titles for a very long time before we landed on the term Zugzwang. And Zugzwang is a fantastic word because it's very particular. Of course, it pertains to chess, the game of chess. But it's also one of those wonderful German words that is almost impossible to translate into English, so much so, and despite the fact that it's a Zungenbrecher, I had to stand in front of the mirror so often and go, Zugzwang, Zugzwang. So, it's still used in English. So maybe you could talk about how the title really infuses itself throughout the entire exhibition.
Yeah, so is my microphone on? Is this working? Okay, good, okay. So, yes, Zugzwang is a German term, and I guess in English you could maybe translate it like something as the compulsion to move from a disadvantaged position. And chess as a game, as an intelligence game or a strategy game where basically the more intelligent person wins has been important to me in relation to these documents that you will see in the exhibition. So there are 31 documents that form basically from 3 different bodies of documents. So one is an asylum application, the other one is a registration for an apartment, which is a quite German thing, and then the application for citizenship. So within my exhibition, all these documents are fictional, but they are based on real documents, so they are remade, but based on a reality. And on top of those documents, you can follow one chess game from beginning to end. And yeah, it's quite a very famous chess game by a Mexican chess player, and it's a game from 1926. But yeah, I can tell you about that later. Zugzwang is, for me, within these documents, what was interesting for me was I was reading a lot of anthropological studies, actually, about the asylum bureaucracy process and how the bureaucrat, which is like a lot of times a street-level bureaucrat, comes to the decision they make a lot of times based on incoherencies and ambivalences, because it's extremely difficult to categorize somebody as a refugee, for example. How do you do that? Which, parts of your identity do you reveal? Which parts do you hide? Or how do you constitute such a case? So, yeah, I think that's to Zugzwang.
Just in terms of the way in which fiction and reality sort of make their way throughout your work, as well as references to literary sources, so not just bureaucracies. And obviously, we just had a preview before, and somebody came up to me and was pointing at the documents and said, "These can't possibly be true." And it's like, these are true documents. It's, you've erased essentially just the names of the countries or any specific reference, but the questions themselves are very much true. And one sees this throughout the exhibition, the way in which fantasy and reality intermingle with each other, and particularly with the newspapers that you've left around the space, which discuss various stories in which the line between truth and fiction it becomes blurry. And I think sort of the best way to sort of this, I suppose, the entry point into this whole thing is the story of Mr. Stevens. Could you please say something about Mr. Stevens?
There are 3 newspaper articles that kind of accommodate you throughout the show and hopefully reveal different aspects of the exhibition to you. One is called Manning the Deck, that's about Mr. Stevens. The other one is called Citizens of Nowhere, and the third one is called Borders 2.0. And Manning the Deck is a newspaper article about Mr. Stevens, and in my case, Mr. Stevens is a bureaucrat, but it's based on a fictional protagonist of Ishiguro's novel, The Remains of the Day, that also got made into a film that you might know with Anthony Hopkins. And in the novel, James Stevens is a butler, and he follows the rules from his lord, his employer, who is Lord Darlington. And throughout the novel, we see that Lord Darlington, believes that the Nazis are going to bring peace, and he just sort of blindly, believes in that narrative. But obviously, we know that had other consequences in history. But that's sort of a side story. Within my newspaper article, the bureaucrat, Mr. Stevens, follows the rules of Brussels, quite, blindly as well. And the installation that you will see, which has an office desk and 2 shelves, is kind of based, it's inspired by him, by this fictional person. Mr. Stevens, for example, is married to a Vietnamese woman, and he has a daughter that lives in London, and it starts to become kind of autofiction, where I interweave personal and fictive elements, but they remain unclear. Yeah.
So, Monira, from the very beginning, your work has revolved around visions of the future, or makes use of these. At the entrance to the exhibition, we're presenting a sculpture called Alien Technology, the shape of which is derived from oil drills. So their material is fiberglass, which shimmers in the colors of shiny oil, black, purple, and green. And can you explain to us what the term alien technology means, and what the future play a role in your artistic work?
Well, hello. Alien technology is actually it's quite an older work of mine. It's the first work I did in this series where I was contemplating basically creating a monument to the post-oil generation, which I belong to. I'm born in the 80s, very much after the discovery of oil in Kuwait, and the official narrative is that our heritage is camels in the desert and pearl diving and boats and things like this, and I always felt these things are fictional because they have nothing to do with my life. But oil as a substance, as a fuel source, will be worthless very soon. So I was thinking that I need to create a monument to my generation to commemorate this alien substance that kind of almost landed there completely randomly and created this massive amounts of obscene wealth, and then it will leave again. So this alien, we have to maybe commemorate it because it will be gone soon. And I really think the oil interval in history is a freak interval in history. And so I'm a freak myself. And, there won't be many other people like me. And what will happen after oil? And, 100 years from now, will we understand what these drills even are? If we dig them out of the earth, will we think there's some kind of artifact of the ancient people of this place? Because it's an unsustainable thing, and it's inevitable that this consequence will happen. So I always also have an existential kind of relationship to this substance that is the remnants of dinosaur bones and blood deep in the earth.
So I was very impressed by a statement you made. You said, "We live in an economic and political space age, a serfdom of virtual social subject who spy on each other, betray on each other, condemn each other, but suffer and die together. Invisible bodies dissolve in the sunlight." So you refer here to a common existence that we share as humans. And with your new intermediate work, Holy Quarter, you focus on the desert, so as one of the oldest and most untouched habitats on Earth. So you set out on a search for meaning of existence. And can you tell us the story behind your new work from your perspective, and to what extent it represents, let's say, turning point for you in your artistic work?
Yes, I've been. I think the Middle East in general is going through a very difficult time now, where we are seeing all the kind of narratives related to the past and history and politics and even social life crumbling before our eyes. So the future is very vague. So my idea is to try to find something beyond these narratives, a more pure, maybe prehistoric past that has more to do with the geology and outer space and things that cannot be corrupted by the present moment and also may have a different life in the future. So the idea is also to reach back into this place, to rediscover a different relationship with it than the one we have now. Yeah.
I'd actually like to pose a question to both of you, because one of the great things about the Capsule exhibitions, as we mentioned already, is that they are curated and conceived and developed completely autonomously to one another. Yet at the end, we always find these wonderful points of convergence between the two artists. And one thing that is obviously very strong in both your works, for very different reasons, is a very, very strong connection to obviously music and soundtrack and score, and the ways in which music can act almost sculpturally in terms of forming a sort of as an independent form of itself, whether or not it's a complement to the sculptural objects that lit your presentation, or indeed Sung as a way to sort of bring people through the spaces. So I'd be really interested, maybe first Monira and then Sung, to talk about this engagement with, and the specific engagement with the music or the score or the sound within your works.
I have to say this quite honestly. I'm a child of the 80s, so I grew up with music videos. And I really, I found that when I was younger as the ultimate artistic format. That, you know, the sound and video and actors and all different things, and it was just a magical experience for me, and it never left. Even in my practice, I made music videos where I acted the role of the singer before, and music has been an intrinsic part of my practice. And I used to also make music when I was much younger, then I stopped, but my sister Fatima Al Qadiri, she's a very well-known musician, and we've collaborated many times before, and even in this project we've collaborated again, and it's very strange. We always have this telepathic relationship where I'm working on something and she's working on something else, and suddenly they work together at the same time. So actually this is what happened. It was a happy coincidence, but yeah, music is very present always in my work. I always think of my work as some kind of music video, really.
And Sung, in relation, I mean, we have to address the elephant in the room here, Wagner. We are in Operstadt, so.
I mean, obviously that was a conscious choice to do that, but I'm making a very absurd and bizarre version of Wagner's Overture to Tannhäuser, because what you will hear is actually a collapse between office noises. So you hear a printer running through the exhibition, and mouse clicking, and what else? Telephone ringing, the clock, running endlessly, and that is basically weaved into the Wagner composition. And it's a 6-channel sound work that is 20 minutes long, and it's basically set up for each channel to play together, almost like an orchestra. So you have actually speakers that are hidden in various objects, so you actually don't really see the sound source, and that's a very important aspect of my work, that there is a strange displacement away from the source of sound. So you actually don't quite know where it's coming from and how these things come together. And I worked with a musician and a very good friend of mine, Alexis Chan, on the sound work, and we created instruments out of noises. So we actually took for example, a telephone ring and try to turn that into a scoreable instrument. And out of, by doing that, we then used Wagner's score to create the sound work. So it's a quite complex and layered process, and creates a very, carnivalesque, funny, and at times painful sound installation.
So I've also a question to you. So you make mechanisms of oppression and threat visible, and among other things, you develop impressive objects and sculptures yourself. So is it as if they were made of steel, and you charge them with personal things? To what extent do masculinity and materiality phantasms of modernity in the 20th century play a role in this?
So actually this is the first time that I'm interweaving very private and personal objects with these extremely oppressive furniture that you will see in the exhibition. So it's actually very new and weird for myself to do that. And I look forward to seeing how that's gonna develop further in my work. But the relationship to modernism is extremely important, and also to conceptualism in relationship to art. Like I think a lot about Judd, or you mentioned Carl Andre, and in relationship to the shelves. And we at times perhaps don't question the oppressive nature of very stripped back furniture. So what you see at the end of the exhibition are 3 seating units that are sourced from a UK prison supplier. So they are actually furniture for prisons. And behind those seating units is a stainless steel metal panel that is engraved with a forest site. So I went to the German-Czech border and took a photograph of the forest, and you can see an abstracted engraving of that on the metal. And then within the shelves, these over-dimensional shelves, there are very small, at times very personal objects in there. They are mixed with objects from offices or from things that I sourced online, and it's at times uncertain what is personal, what isn't. And I think it maybe perhaps shows how small the human is within a bureaucratic state. That's at least what I intended to do. Yeah.
I have actually one more question for Monira. Seeing these waba pearls, these beautiful organic, out of this world, as you say, sort of shapes that were sort of collected and brought back, and had all of these wonderful mythologies attached to them, about lost cities and things like that. Within the context of being exhibited here, I always think about the history of the Wunderkammer in Germany, which was a sort of an early prototype of the museum, where explorers would go off for colonial countries, and they would come back with these objects that they would claim. They would a tree stump with some ivory horns coming out that they would say was actually an ancient animal and things, and the way in which that these ostrich eggs that they would actually sort of say that there was these pearls from these ancient kingdoms. This element of the sort of the mystery and the fantasy in this. And the way in which you've deliberately blown them up to incredible sort of proportion. Could you just talk a little bit more about the sort of the mythologies behind these things, because it's quite fascinating, the sort of the multifaceted nature one can read from these objects.
Yes, I mean the story follows this explorer who's a British man named St. John Philby, who walked across the desert in the 1930s. And my favorite part of the story is that he thought he would find this ancient city buried in the desert and become rich and famous. But my favorite part about it is that he didn't find it, and he was so disappointed, and he almost died getting there. And it's just it's ironic, very interesting let's say, narrative that represents so many different things about this also colonial mindset in relation to, these, like you said, faraway lands where they would bring back the riches and you know, show them off as almost like a trophy or something. And then he was confronted with these meteors from outer space, which are even much more interesting and bizarre than a city buried in the sand. But he didn't understand the value of that. And I just find it so interesting and strange that, you know, it represents a lot of things I want to say also about our modern times and how stories develop and also travel and mutate. So the idea was also to create a fictional character out of the meteors themselves, that they would be the narrator of the story, and through this computer simulated voice, you know, become this kind of alien, but somehow the voice is a computer, but it's acting. There are points in the film where you don't even know if it's a human or a machine, because he's actually overacting, and the software is becoming so sophisticated that you can make the computer act even, you know, and say like things that sound more of a horror voice than a you know, soft whispering voice. So I was fascinated by that aspect as well, as that, you know, I think our current life is surrounded by this, I mean, AI, what is that? I mean, it's also mythology. It's something we don't understand, and how will it develop, and how will we deal with it in the future, and will it also kind of become this mythological entity that speaks to us and creates stories for us, and also maybe we might worship it at some point because it's so all-encompassing and so complex that we won't understand it anymore. And I just think that's the kind of basis of the human condition, is that when things are so complicated and difficult and mysterious, just like outer space, for example, that it becomes this holy entity that we can't help but pray to. Yes.
So we have music, we have otherworldly experiences, we have fascination, we have sound, we have industry. What a perfect way to bring us up to the concert that's going to happen at 9 o'clock, which we're going to prepare now. For anyone who's never heard or seen Praed before, you're in for something out of this world, I can guarantee. Aber jetzt, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, haben Sie die Gelegenheit, die Ausstellung zu besuchen. Wir treffen uns hier um 21 Uhr für die Konzert und danach die große Party. Also herzlich willkommen und schönen Abend.